This is part 22 of AngularJS tutorial. In our previous video, we discussed using Angular anchor scroll service with data that is hard-coded on the web page. In this video, we'll discuss using the anchor scroll service with database data. Let me explain what I mean. In our SQL Server database, we are going to have these two tables. The first table contains 3 country names, and the second table contains the cities that belong to these 3 countries. Look at the country ID column for the first 5 rows. It's 1. So the first 5 cities, they belong to country India. Similarly, we have cities belonging to USA and UK. So we want to retrieve data from these two tables and display it on the web page. As you can see here, notice at the top of the page we have 3 buttons, one button for each country. And then here we have a field set. The legend for the field set is the name of the country, and then within the field set we have an unordered list which is displaying the cities that belong to that country. So on this page we've got 3 field sets, one field set for each country. At the moment, country India along with its cities is visible. Now if we want to see country USA, then we have to use the scroll bar and then scroll down to the page. Similarly, if we want to see the country UK, then we have to scroll a bit more further down. Instead of manually scrolling like that, we want to use these buttons. So whenever I click on a button, we want the page to automatically scroll to that country. So all this data is coming from the database tables. So let's see how to achieve this using anchor scroll service. The first step here is to create these 2 database tables, which I have already done. So here is the SQL script to create those tables and populate them with test data. I'll have the script available on my blog in case you need it. The next step is to create our ASP.NET Web Application project. I've done that also. And to this project I have added this web.config file. Within the web.config file we have a connection string that is pointing to sample DB database which contains our tables. To this web.config file I'm going to add another section. And this section is required because we want to enable HTTP GET protocol for ASMX web services, because we are going to use ASMX web service to retrieve data from the database. So within System.Web I'm going to include web services, and under that protocols, and the protocol that we are going to add is HTTP GET. So this enables HTTP GET for ASP.NET web service. The next step is to add 2 classes. We have got 2 tables, country and cities. So within the country table we have ID and name columns. So we will have a country class which will have ID and name properties. Similarly, we'll have a city class which contains ID, name and country ID properties. So let's add a class file to our project. So I'm going to add a class file. Let's name this city.cs. So the city class is going to contain an integer property. Let's name it ID. This is going to be auto implemented property. Similarly, we're going to have name and country ID. The name property is going to be of type string, and country ID is of type integer. So those are the 3 properties of the city class. I'm going to add another class file. Let's name this country.cs. Country class is also going to have ID, name, and this is going to have another property, and this is going to be of type list of city, and I'm going to call this cities. So this property is going to contain all the cities that belong to a given country. The next step is to add our web service itself. So let's right click on the project, add a new item, and the new item that we want to add is ASMX web service, and let's call this country service.asmx. In the interest of time, I've already typed the required code for a web service, so let's copy and paste it right here. Now within this web service we have some ADO.NET code, so that's the reason why we have imported these ADO.NET namespaces: System.Configuration, System.Data, System.Data.SqlClient. And we are also using JavaScript serializer class within this web service to serialize the data to JSON format, and that JavaScript serializer class is present in this namespace, System.Web.Script.Serialization. So the name of our web service is country service, and since we want this web service to be called from JavaScript, we decorated with script service attribute. Since it's a web service, it inherits from WebService base class, and within our web service we have a single web method getData. Within this method we have some ADO.NET code which is retrieving data from the database. So first we are creating a variable of type list of country. So this variable is going to contain all the countries that we want to convert to JSON and return. So first we are reading the connection string from web.config file. We are then using that connection string and creating a SQL connection object, and then we are creating our SQL command object. Look at the SQL command object. It has got two select statements: select star from TBL country, semicolon, select star from TBL city. And then we are creating SQL data adapter object, and then the data set object, and then we are calling the fill method of the data adapter object. So at this point it's going to open a connection to the database, execute these two SQL statements, retrieve the data, and fill that in the data set. So by the time this line executes, within our data set we are going to have two tables. The first table is for countries and the second table is for cities. So countries table is present at index position 0 within the data set, and cities table is present at index position 1. The next step here is to create a data view, and notice this data view is based on cities table because at index position 1 we have the cities table. Now this default data view contains all the rows from the cities table, and then we are looping through each data row that is present in the countries table. At index position 0 we have the countries table, so we are looping through each data row that is present in the countries table, and then we are creating the country object. And if you look at our country class, it has got ID, name, and cities properties. So here we are populating ID and name properties. Now we need to populate cities property as well. Now to populate cities property, we first have to build the list of cities that belong to the given country. So if we are looping through, let's say for example India at the moment, then we only want to get Indian cities and then add them to the cities collection and set that as the value for cities property on the country object. So that's what we will be doing next. So here we are using the data view. So this is the data view that is based on cities table. So on that we are applying a row filter, and we are saying give me all countries where country ID equals whatever is the ID property value of the country object. So at the moment if we are looping through India country, then the ID will be 1. So this data view is only going to contain cities that belong to India. And then we are creating a variable of type list of city, and we are looping through each data row view that is present in this filtered data view. And then to get the underlying data row that is present within the data row view object, we use the row property. And then we are creating the city object, populating ID, name, country ID properties, and then adding that city object to this list of cities. And then finally, once we are done looping through all the cities of a given country object, we are setting that as the value for the cities property of the country object. And finally we are adding that country object to list of countries. So we have the list of countries right here. And then finally we are creating an instance of JavaScript serializer class and serializing the list of countries to JSON format. So let's quickly test our web service to make sure it's doing what it is supposed to do. So now we should see getData method, and when we invoke it, notice we get the ID of the country, the name of the country, and all the cities that belong to that specific country. Alright, so now let's write our Angular code to call that web service. So here within our scripts folder we already have the AngularJS script. So let's add another script file. So I'm going to call this script.js. Now we want IntelliSense for Angular, so I'm going to drag and drop that there. So we are going to create a variable here. I'm going to call this demo app equals, let's use angular.module method. We're going to create a module. Let's name our module demo app, and we don't have any dependencies, so I'm going to pass an empty array. The next step is to create our controller. So let's give our controller a meaningful name. I'm going to call it country controller. So this is going to be a function, and the country controller function is going to have 4 parameters. The first one is going to be the $scope object. The next one is going to be $HTTP service, and the next one is going to be location service, and the final one is going to be anchorscroll service. So the first thing that we want to do here is use the HTTP service and call the web service. So I'm going to use the get method, and the name of our web service is countryservice.asmx. So let's copy that from here, and within our country service we have a web method with name getData. So that's what we want to call. So issue a get request to countryservice.asmx, and the name of the method is getData. So this is going to give us a promise, so we are going to use .then, and as soon as the request completes, we are going to get a response back. And what we want to do is attach a property to our scope object, and I'm going to call it countries. So countries equals whatever we have in the response. So set the data as the value for countries property that we have attached to the scope object. So this countries will have the data that we have retrieved from the database. We're going to do another thing within our controller. So I'm going to attach a function to the scope object. I'm going to call this scroll2. So this is going to be a function, and to this function let's pass the name of the country name, and we're going to use the location service, and it has got hash method. So what is this hash method going to do? It's going to append that country name to the URL, okay, with a pound sign in front of that. And then when we call anchorscroll method will read that country name from the URL and automatically scroll to that location on the web page. We'll see that in action in just a bit. So that's our controller there. Now the next step is to create some styles for the data that we want to display on the web page. Look at this, the font style is Arial, the font size is extra large, and we have a border around the div element. There is a height and width set for the div element as well, which is surrounding the field sets. So let's apply those styles. So I'm going to add a style sheet to our project. So let's add a style sheet, and I'm going to call this styles.css. So font family is going to be Arial. So let's apply it on the body element, and I'm going to create a style for the div element. So first of all, we want the div to be displayed as a block, and we want font size to be extra large, and we want height to be 350 pixels, width to be 400 pixels, and we want a border of 1 pixel, solid black, and we want a padding of maybe 10 pixels, and finally we want a scroll bar. If the data within the div overflows, we want a scroll bar. So overflow y is scroll. Okay, so those are the styles we want, and now all that is left is to write the required HTML. So I'm going to drag and drop the Angular script, and we want our JavaScript code that we have written and the style sheet itself. Okay, So within our body section, so before we write any HTML here, the first thing that we want to do is at the HTML element level, we want to specify our ng app. And what's the name of the module that we have created? It's demo app. So let's copy that and specify it right there. And we want our country controller to be in charge of the body section. And if you remember, the name of the controller is country controller. Alright, so how do we want to display the data? First, we want these buttons. So what I'm going to do here is actually use a span element, and on the span element I'm going to use ng repeat directive. So I'm going to loop through each country in countries. So where is this countries coming from? This is coming from the scope object. Remember, within our controller we are attaching a property to the scope object, which is countries. So that contains all the data that we retrieve from the database. So we are looping through each country, and what do we want to do? We want to create a button, and when we click the button, what do we want to do? We want to call this scroll to function, and to this function we have to pass the name of the country, right? So we want to call that scroll to function, and look at this, we have access to the country that we are currently looping over using this variable, and we are going to use the name property of the country object. And then on the button itself, what do we want to do? We want to display the name of the country. Okay, so that's going to take care of displaying these three buttons. And then let's give some break between the button element and the field sets. So I'm going to include a break, two breaks in fact, and then we are going to include a div element. And inside the div element, what do we want? We want a field set. So that's what we'll first create. So for the field set, what do we want to do? We want a field set for every country. So we are going to loop through again each country. So let's use ng repeat directive again, and let's loop through each country, and let's give an ID for each of the field set, and the ID is going to be the name of the country, country.name. Okay, so what is the legend that we want within the field set? The name of the country. So again we are going to use country.name. And then once we have the legend within the field set, we want an unordered list to display all the cities that belong to the country. So let's create an unordered list, and within that we are going to create a list item, and on the list item we are going to use the ng repeat. So we want a list item for every city within a given country. So I'm going to loop through each city. So for each city in country.cities property has the list of cities belonging to a given country. So what do we want to do? We want to display city.name. So that's all there to it. Now let's run this page and see if we get what we expect. Look at that, we get the data as we expect. So India, USA, UK, and at the moment we are looking at India, and look at the URL right here. We don't have anything on the URL. The moment we click this button, what is going to happen? When we click the button, it's going to call scroll to function and pass the name of the country. So when we pass the name of the country, what's happening is, this hash method is going to add that country name to the end of the URL using a hash symbol. And then when this anchor scroll method is called, it's going to scroll to that location, to that element with that ID. And if you look at what we are doing within the HTML, notice for the field set we have set the ID also to the country name itself. So for example, when we click USA, notice what happens to the URL. It appends #USA to the URL. And keep in mind, the ID of this field set is also USA. So when this anchor scroll method is called, it reads the hashed fragment, that is USA. We also have an element with ID USA on the page, so it's automatically going to jump to that element on the page. So that's how we are able to jump to any element by simply clicking on the respective button. Thank you for listening and have a great day.